Her hand shook so hard the glove nearly slipped from her fingers, and she pressed it flat against her heart to stop it. 16 years she had answered to a name that was not hers. 16 years she had told herself the man who buried her was dead to her. And now he stood 40 feet away alive, laughing, wearing her father's ring. If you have ever been told to disappear so someone else could take what was yours, stay with me to the very end. Subscribe, follow this story, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far Eleanor's name has traveled. The music started, and Eleanor Reed did not move. She had learned young that stillness was a kind of hiding. A woman who never reached, never laughed too loud, never let her eyes climb higher than a gentleman's second waistcoat button. That woman could stand in a room full of the wealthiest families in Virginia and vanish clean out of memory the moment she left it. She had made herself into that woman on purpose. She had spent 16 years perfecting her. "You'll fetch my shawl the instant I lift my hand," said Mrs. Prudence Halliway without turning her head. "The blue one, not the gray. I brought the gray to test you, and I'll not be tested back." "Yes, ma'am. And you'll not sit unless I sit." A companion who sits before her mistress is a companion who forgets herself. "I won't forget myself, ma'am. See that you don't." The old woman's fan snapped open. "This is the Ashford summer ball. Half the state would sell a daughter to stand where you're standing, and you standing there in gray like a Tuesday morning." "Lord?" Eleanor said nothing. She had found long ago that silence cost less than any answer. She kept her hands folded and her chin low and let the room move around her, the fiddle and the low murmur of men talking money in the corners, the rustle of good silk, the particular sound a great house makes in summer, when every window is thrown open and the heat pushes the perfume of 100 flowers indoors until a body could grow dizzy on it. She counted. She always counted. 4 breaths in, hold, 4 breaths out. It was the only prayer she had left that ever seemed to answer. "You are not listening to me," Mrs. Halliway said. "I am, ma'am, the blue shawl. I'm to fetch it when you lift your hand." "Then look at me when I speak, girl. Your eyes are all over the room like you're waiting for someone." "I'm not waiting for anyone." That much at least was true. Eleanor Reed had spent 16 years waiting for no one because she had learned that the people you wait for do not come, and the people who come are the ones you spend your whole life praying never will. Then she turned her head because Mrs. Halliway had told her to, and she saw him. Her breath stopped between the second count and the third. He was older now. That was the first thing, the cruel arithmetic of it, because in her memory he had never aged a single day. In her memory he was 39, and standing in the doorway of her father's study with a candle in his hand and a look on his face she had not understood as a child, and understood too well now. But here he was, 58 gray at the temples, thicker through the middle, laughing with his head tipped back at something a fat man in a green coat had said. And on the smallest finger of his left hand he wore a ring she would have known blind in the dark at the bottom of the sea. Badimbam. Her father's ring. Silas Whitcomb. The name came up in her like water in a drowning man's lungs. "Girl," Mrs. Halliway's fan tapped her wrist hard. "You've gone the color of a fish belly. Are you going to faint on me? Because if you faint, I'll leave you on the floor, I promise you that." "No, ma'am." Her own voice came from a great distance. "I'm well." "You don't look well." "The heat. The heat." Mrs. Halliway sniffed. "The heat is the same for all of us, and I'm not going the color of a fish. Sit. There on the stool. Sit before you drop and shame me." Eleanor sat. It was the wrong thing she had been told, never to sit before. Her mistress sat, but her legs had stopped believing in her, and she folded down onto the little stool by Mrs. Halliway's chair and put her cold hand flat against her own breastbone and counted. 4 in. Hold. 4 out. He had not seen her. That was the thing to hold on to. He was across the whole width of the Ashford ballroom, 40 feet of candlelight, and dancing bodies between them. And he was laughing at the fat man in green, and he had not seen her, and he could not see her, because Eleanor Whitcomb had died of a fever in the winter of 1800 at the age of 10, and Silas Whitcomb had wept very prettily at her funeral, and everyone in 3 counties knew it, and dead girls do not sit on stools at summer balls. She had watched him weep. That was the part no one knew. She had been in the carriage already bundled in a rough blanket, with a strange woman's hand clamped over her mouth, and through a gap in the curtain she had watched her uncle stand at the door of Whitcomb Hall and dab his eyes with a white handkerchief, while the neighbors murmured how hard he took it, poor man. First the brother and now the child, all in one dreadful season. She had been 10. She had not screamed. She had learned in that carriage the thing she had spent her whole life since perfecting, that a girl who makes no sound is a girl who is harder to kill. "You are shaking the stool," Mrs. Halloway said. "Stop it." "I'm sorry, ma'am." "What ails you? Read truthfully now." And Eleanor almost told her. That was the terror of it, that after 16 years of silence, one look at that ring on that finger had loosened something in her chest, and the truth stood right up behind her teeth like a horse at a broken gate. That man stole my father's house. That man told the world I was dead. That man is wearing my father's ring on his little finger because his own hands were always too fat for it. "Nothing ails me, ma'am," she said. "I forgot to eat before we came." "Well, there's a table of it right there, isn't there? Go. Fetch me a plate while you're up, and something small for yourself, so you'll stop swaying. And keep your head down. You look at no one, and no one looks at you. That's how a companion keeps her place." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor rose. And here was mercy. The food tables stood at the far wall, and the far wall was the wall furthest from Silas Whitcomb, and she could cross to them with her back to him the whole way. She kept her chin low. She kept her steps small. She was gray on gray in a room made of gold, and she was nobody. And nobody is invisible. And she had almost reached the safety of the table when a man's voice, low and dry and amused, said just above her shoulder, "You're the only person in this room who isn't pretending to have a wonderful time. I find I'd rather stand next to you than any of them." She did not look up. Every rule she had ever made for herself said, "Do not look up." A companion in gray does not get spoken to by gentlemen. When she is spoken to, it is a mistake or a cruelty, and either way the answer is to lower the eyes further and murmur, "Beg pardon, sir," and move on until the man forgets he ever opened his mouth. "Beg pardon, sir," she said. "I'm only fetching a plate for my mistress." "I know what you're doing. You've been doing it for an hour. You fetch and you fold your hands and you count something under your breath." A pause. "I've been trying to work out what it is you count. The candles, the exits." Now she looked up. She would spend a long time afterward trying to decide why she looked up when she had made herself a person who never did. She thought later that it was the word exits. No one had ever said it aloud. No one had ever guessed that when Eleanor Reed stood at the edge of a room folding her hands, she was in fact counting the ways out of it, always, every room since she was 10 years old. The man looking down at her was perhaps 35. Dark, tall, a hard, clean-shaven face that she supposed the other women in the room found handsome, and that she found at once tired, the particular tiredness of a person who has been looked at his whole life by people who see a fortune where a face should be. His coat was very fine, and he wore it like it bored him. "I don't count the exits, sir," she said. "No, no." "Then I stand corrected, and I apologize." But he did not move away. He tipped his head slightly, studying her, and something in his eyes was not the thing she was braced for. She knew what men's eyes did to a poor woman standing alone by a wall. This was not that. This was a man looking at a locked door and wondering idly, honestly, what was behind it. "Forgive me. It's only that I've stood at the edge of 200 of these evenings myself, and I've never once seen anyone else who looked as though they'd rather be anywhere on God's earth but here. It made me feel less alone. That was selfish of me. I've made you drop your guard, and now you're frightened of me. Don't be. I'll go." "You needn't go, sir," she heard herself say. The words were out before she could stop them, and she was appalled at them, and she could not call them back. He didn't go. "Ashford," he said. "Nathaniel Ashford. This is my mother's house, which means I'm obliged to stand in it and be pleasant, which is why I'm hiding at the food tables, talking to the one sensible person here." He inclined his head. And you are? Reed. Eleanor Reed. I'm companion to Mrs. Halloway. Miss Reed. He said it the way a man tries the weight of a coin. You don't look like a companion. Her heart kicked so hard she pressed her plate flatter against her stomach. I'm sure I don't know what a companion is supposed to look like, sir. Grateful, he said. They usually look grateful. And a little afraid. You look... He stopped. He seemed for a moment to genuinely search for it, and she watched him find it, and she braced for it. You look like someone standing on a frozen river, he said, listening to the ice. She said nothing. She could not have said anything. He had, in one sentence, described the whole architecture of her life, and he did not even know he'd done it, and she wanted at that moment to slap the plate to the floor and run out into the night and never stop running. I've offended you again, Nathaniel said. I have a genius for it. Ask anyone in this room, they'll tell you Ashford has a fortune and no manners. They say it behind their fans, and I hear every word. Let me make amends. Dance with me. I can't. You can. Everyone can. It's mostly walking. I'm a companion, sir. Companions don't dance with... She caught herself. With the sons of the house. My mistress would dismiss me before the music ended. Which mistress? Mrs. Halloway, the lady in the puce gown by the window with the fan. Nathaniel turned his head, found Mrs. Halloway, considered her for the length of 2 breaths, and turned back with something that was almost a smile. Prudence Halloway has been trying to marry a granddaughter into my family for 11 years. She's brought 3 of them to my mother's balls, and I've danced with all 3 out of pure Christian duty and married none of them. If I ask you to dance, Miss Reed, and she so much as thinks of dismissing you, I will make it known that I intend to dance with no Halloway granddaughter ever again for the rest of my natural life. She will keep you. She'll keep you and promote you. Trust me. I know exactly what these people are afraid of, because it's the only power I've ever had over them. That's a cruel sort of power, sir. Yes, he said, and the almost smile went out of him. It is. It's the only kind they've left me. Dance with me anyway. And Eleanor Reed, who had not danced in 16 years, who had made herself a woman who did not dance, did not want, did not reach, set her mistress's empty plate down on the edge of the table and put her cold hand into the hand of Nathaniel Ashford and let him lead her out onto the floor while every fan in the room went still. She would ask herself later why. She would never be able to answer it, except to say this for 1 hour in the middle of the most dangerous room she had ever stood in. A man had looked at her and seen a person instead of a shadow. And after 16 years of being no one, the wanting to be seen had proved stronger than the fear of being found. They danced. He was right. It was mostly walking. And her feet remembered more than she'd thought they would some buried girl self, who had once been taught the steps in a bright room by a mother she could barely picture anymore. He held her correctly at the proper distance, his hand light. He did not crush her fingers. He did not pull her closer than the figure required, and he talked low only to her under the music so that no one else could hear. There, you haven't turned to stone. You were afraid you would. I was afraid I'd forgotten how. You dance like someone who learned young and stopped. Who taught you? The question landed in her like a hook. I don't recall, sir. Now that's a lie, he said mildly. The first one you've told me. You recall exactly. You just won't say. He turned her and brought her back, and his eyes were steady on hers, and there was nothing greedy in them, only that same steady curiosity. It's all right. You're allowed your locked rooms. God knows I've enough of my own. I only notice things. It's a bad habit. My mother says it makes people uneasy. It does make people uneasy. Does it make you uneasy? She should have said yes. It was the safe answer, the true answer, the answer that would send him off her scent. But she was tired in a way she had not let herself feel in 16 years. Tired down in the marrow, tired of the counting and the folding and the gray. And so instead she said, "It makes me feel like I exist, which I find I'm not used to, and which frightens me more than you do." For the first time all night, Nathaniel Ashford looked genuinely undone. "Miss Reed," he began. "Don't," she said. "Whatever it is, don't say it kindly. I can bear anything but that." He didn't say it. He simply nodded once like a man accepting terms, and they finished the dance in silence, and it was the most she had spoken to another living soul in 16 years. The music ended. She should have curtsied and gone back to the wall. That was the whole of the bargain. One dance, then back to gray, back to nobody. Again, he said. Sir, once more, then I'll release you, I swear it. Once more, Miss Reed, and I'll never trouble you again if you don't wish it. She knew she should refuse. She could feel somewhere behind her the whole room reorganizing itself around the astonishing fact of Nathaniel Ashford dancing twice with a companion in gray, could feel the fans moving, the heads, turning, the low tide of whispers rising. Who is she? Who is that? Where did Ashford find her? She was becoming visible. It was happening in real time, the thing she had spent her whole life preventing, and she was letting it happen because a lonely rich man had a sad face and had said the word exits. Once more, she said. They danced again, and it was in the middle of that second dance as he turned her toward the head of the room that she saw him watching. Silas Whitcomb had stopped laughing. He stood by the tall windows with his glass forgotten in his fat hand, and he was looking at the floor at the dancers, at her, not with recognition, not yet, but with the slow frown of a man who has heard a bar of music he knows and cannot place, who feels a name on the very tip of his tongue and cannot spit it out. His head was tipped, his eyes were narrowed, and she felt his gaze land on her face and slide down and catch on nothing she could name, some angle of her jaw, some way she held her head, some ghost of her dead father in her living face, and hold. Her feet forgot the step. Steady? Nathaniel murmured, catching her covering it. I have you. What is it you've gone white again? I have to go. What's happened? Tell me what's frightened you and you'll do nothing. She had stopped dancing entirely now. She had gripped his sleeve, her fingers digging into the fine wool, and she heard her own voice come out of her low and fast and desperate, in a way it had not been since she was 10 years old in a carriage. Listen to me. You've been kind, and I'll thank you the rest of my life for it, but I have to go, and you must let me, and you must not follow me, and you must forget you ever saw me. Do you understand? Whatever it costs you, however strange it seems. Do not follow me. Do not ask after me. Forget my name. I am asking you the one thing I will ever ask of anyone. Let me disappear. He stared at her. Across the room, Silas Whitcomb had set down his glass. He was saying something to the fat man in the green coat without taking his eyes off her, and the fat man was turning to look too. Miss Reed Eleanor, who are you afraid of? Nathaniel's hand closed over hers where it gripped his sleeve, warm, urgent. Point him out, whoever it is. I own half this county. I can... You can't. She pulled her hand free. No one can. Goodbye, Mr. Ashford. Thank you. God keep you. And Eleanor Reed turned and walked fast, but not running, never running. Running draws the eyes she had learned that at 10-2 walked with her chin down and her shoulders small straight for the nearest of the exits. She was always counting the long doors thrown open onto the summer dark. Behind her, Silas Whitcomb took one step forward, then another, the frown deepening on his broad face, his mouth beginning to shape a word. She did not stay to hear what word. She was through the doors and out into the warm black night, down the wide stone steps, two at a time, out past the waiting carriages, and the drivers dozing on their boxes, and the lanterns swinging in the July dark, out past the edge of the light, entirely into the long grass beyond the Ashford Drive, and only there, with the great lit house behind her full of music and the man who buried her, did Eleanor Whitcomb finally let herself run. She ran until the music was only a rumor. She ran until her lungs burned and her borrowed slippers filled with dew, and her breath came in the same ragged 4 count she had counted in the carriage 16 years before. And when she could run no more, she stopped in the dark of a hedgerow and bent double and pressed both hands to her mouth so that no one on God's earth would hear the sound she was making. And it was there, with her hands clamped over her own mouth, exactly the way that strange woman's hand had clamped over it when she was 10, that Eleanor realized her right hand was bare. She had lost a glove. She turned her hands over in the faint light, disbelieving. Her left hand still wore its white kid glove, embroidered at the cuff in fine silk thread, with a small pattern she had worn for years, and never let herself truly look at the only thing she had carried out of Whitcomb Hall. The only thing the strange woman in the carriage had let her keep pressed into her small, cold fists with the whispered warning to hide them always and never tell a soul where they'd come from. Her mother's wedding gloves. A pair. She had kept them 16 years. She had guarded them through poverty and hunger, and 4 different households had gone without bread rather than sell them. Had told herself they were only sentiment, and known they were the last true thing she owned. And now there was one. She had dropped the other somewhere between the ballroom floor and the summer dark. On the marble and the grass on the stone steps, somewhere back there in the house full of light, lay a single white glove embroidered at the cuff with the crest of a family. The whole state believed had died out entirely, the last living proof that the girl who wore it had ever existed at all. Eleanor stood in the hedgerow with one bare hand pressed to her mouth and understood that she had made a terrible mistake. Back in the great bright house, the second dance had long since ended, and the floor had cleared, and the music had moved on to something the young people liked, and Nathaniel Ashford stood exactly where she had left him, holding a woman's white kid glove that he had bent and picked up off the marble without quite knowing why. Nathaniel! His mother's voice at his elbow. Serene, immovable, the voice of a woman who had run this county through 3 husbands and outlived them all. You danced twice with a servant. Twice. In front of the Vanes. I did. People are talking. Caroline Vane looks as though she's swallowed a wasp. Whatever possessed you? I don't know, he said, and it was the truth. He turned the glove over in his hands. Fine kid, expensive, once worn soft, now at the fingertips. And at the cuff worked in silk that had faded from white to cream, a small neat design, not a flower, not a bird, but a device. The kind of thing an old family embroiders on its linens so that God and the laundress will know whose it is. A shield, a stag, 3 stars above. Who was she, mother? A companion. Prudence Holloway's girl. Reed, I think. Nobody. Why do you have her glove? She dropped it. Then give it to a footman and think no more about it. His mother's fan tapped his arm, the way Prudence Holloway's had tapped Eleanor's, the same gesture in the same room, from the other end of the same power. You are 35, Nathaniel. You cannot keep collecting sad-eyed strangers instead of choosing a wife. It was one dance too with a paid companion, and by morning it will be a story, and I will spend a month unmaking it. Give me the glove. No, Nathaniel said. His mother looked at him. No, he said again more quietly, and he did not entirely understand himself, and he closed his hand around the small worn glove, as if someone might take it from him. He was thinking of a woman on a frozen river, listening to the ice. He was thinking of the word exits, and the way she had said it makes me feel like I exist, and the way she had gripped his sleeve and begged him, that proud, tired woman who had not asked him for a single thing all evening. Not even kindness, begged him to let her disappear. People did not beg to disappear unless someone had spent a long time hunting them. Who was the man, he said. What man? There was a man by the windows. Heavy gray, a green-coated fellow beside him. She looked at him, and He stopped. He had watched her face come apart. He had felt her whole body go to stone in his arms. She was terrified of someone in this room, Mother. She asked me to forget her. She begged me, and then she ran. Mrs. Ashford's serene face did not change, but something behind it grew careful. The heavy gentleman by the windows is Silas Whitcomb. He owns a great estate up the James. Old family, though there's not much left of it, but him brother died young, the whole line failed. He's respectable enough, wealthy. Why? Whitcomb. Nathaniel repeated. He looked down at the glove in his hand, at the small faded device worked into the cuff, a shield, a stag, 3 stars. He did not know yet what it was. He would not know for weeks, would carry the thing in his breast pocket, like a fool would take it out and study it. By candlelight would finally show it to an ancient half-blind cousin of his mother's, who had danced at every wedding in Virginia for 60 years, and who would take one look at it and go pale and say, "Why, that's the Whitcomb Crest boy." Where did you get it? That family's gloves went into the ground with the last of them. But that was weeks away. For now, Nathaniel Ashford only stood in his mother's ballroom with a dead woman's crest in his fist and a living woman's terror still ringing in his ears, and he made himself a promise that he did not yet know would cost him a year of his life and every certainty he owned. Her name isn't Reed, he said, and I'm going to find out what it is. Out in the dark, a mile off, and still walking. Eleanor Whitcomb pulled her one remaining glove from her bare left hand at last, and folded the pair of them, the one she had, the one she'd lost already. A ghost between her fingers. No, only the one now, and she pressed that single glove to her chest, and kept walking toward the town and the small cold room that waited for her there. And she did not weep, because she had taught herself long ago that weeping was a sound, and sounds were dangerous, and a girl who makes no sound is a girl who is harder to kill. She told herself he would forget her. She told herself the glove would be swept up and thrown out with the wilted flowers and the guttered candles, that no one in that house full of rich strangers could possibly know what the small faded crest at its cuff had once meant, that by morning she would be nobody again and safe again, and the whole terrible bright hour would fade like a fever dream. She was wrong about every part of it, but she did not know that yet. She only knew that she had let herself be seen after 16 years of hiding, and that her uncle had turned from the window with a name forming on his lips, and that somewhere behind her in the summer dark, a piece of the truth she had guarded her whole life had slipped from her hand and fallen into the world where anyone at all might pick it up. She reached the town near midnight. She let herself into the narrow house where Mrs. Halloway had taken rooms, and she climbed the back stairs in the dark without a candle. And she sat on the edge of the hard bed in the small hot room, and she held the single glove in both hands, and at last, only then, only there, with the door shut, and no living soul to hear, Eleanor Whitcomb bent over her mother's glove and made no sound at all. Downstairs, an hour later, Mrs. Halloway came in loud and furious from the ball, having been made to wait for her carriage a full 40 minutes, and having heard from 3 separate ladies behind 3 separate fans, the most extraordinary thing that Nathaniel Ashford, who would dance with no one who had rejected Vane girls and Carter girls and every Halloway granddaughter she'd ever dragged before him, had danced twice. Twice with a nobody in gray, and that the nobody had then fled into the night like a thief, and that Ashford had stood on the floor afterward, holding her dropped glove, and refusing to give it up even to his own mother. "Reed!" the old woman bellowed up the stairs. "Reed, come down here this instant. I want the truth out of you, and I want it now." And in the small hot room above, Eleanor lifted her head from her mother's glove and wiped her face dry with the back of her bare hand, and composed her features into the mask she had worn for 16 years, and rose to go down and lie. She did not yet know that a mile away, a man was sitting up late by a single candle, turning a glove over and over in his hands, tracing a crest he could not read with the tip of one finger, unable to sleep, unable to stop, already caught. She only knew that she had broken her own first rule. She had let herself be seen. And in a world that had spent 16 years pretending she was dead, being seen was the most dangerous thing of all. The lie held for exactly 9 days. Eleanor stood in Mrs. Halloway's parlor that first morning, with her hands folded and her chin low, and told the old woman what she'd rehearsed on the stairs, that Mr. Ashford had spoken to her out of pity, that she'd danced because refusing the son of the house would have caused a scene, that she'd fled because she felt faint from the heat and was ashamed of the attention. "Faint from the heat," Mrs. Halloway repeated. "And the glove." "I dropped it, ma'am. I'll buy another out of my wages." "You'll do no such thing. You'll get it back. A man does not keep a woman's glove out of nothing, Reed. I've buried 3 husbands. Don't tell me what a man keeps a glove for." "He kept it out of nothing, ma'am. He'll have thrown it away by now." But the old woman was watching her too closely, and Eleanor made herself go still under it, made herself the gray nobody she had spent 16 years perfecting. And after a long moment, Mrs. Halloway sniffed and turned away, and the danger passed. It was the 10th day it broke. She was at the market with the housekeeper's basket over her arm, when a boy in Ashford livery walked the length of the square, calling a name. Not her name, thank God, not any name, only the lady who danced with Mr. Ashford at the summer ball, the lady in gray as she known here. and Eleanor set down the basket very quietly among the cabbages and walked out of the square the other way and did not stop walking until the calling was gone behind her. He was looking. He had promised her he would, and she had prayed he was only a lonely man who forgot his promises by morning, and she had been wrong, and now there was a boy in the square with her description in his mouth. She went back to the narrow house and she packed her small bag. "You'll go where?" Mrs. Halloway said flatly when Eleanor told her. "A companion doesn't just up and go. Where's your family? You've never once spoken of family." "I have none, ma'am. That's why I can go. None." The old woman's fan hung slack in her hand for once. "Everyone has some. A dead mother, a runaway brother, something. You've got nobody at all. Nobody, ma'am." And Mrs. Halloway looked at her for a long moment, and something crossed the hard old face that Eleanor had never seen there before, not suspicion this time, but a kind of recognition, one lonely woman knowing another. "Sit down, Reed," she said gruff. "You'll not go tonight, it's near dark, and you've nowhere. You'll go in the morning if you must go, and you'll take a month's wages, not the half you're owed, and you'll not argue with me about it." "Ma'am, I can't." "You'll take it. I don't do it for love of you. God knows you're a strange, cold girl and no comfort to anyone. I do it because I know the look of a woman running from something, and I had it myself once 40 years gone, and nobody gave me a month's wages." She snapped the fan shut. "Go on up. Pack proper. Whoever it is you're running from, girl, I hope you outlast him." Eleanor climbed the stairs with her throat tight, and for the first time in 16 years, she had been shown a kindness she could not account for, and it undid her more than any cruelty could have. She did not go in the morning. She meant to. She was dressed, and her bag was packed before the light came, and she was standing at the top of the stairs when there was a knock at the front door below. Not a servant's knock, not the baker or the coal man, but 3 slow, deliberate raps of a walking stick against wood. And Eleanor stopped on the stairs with her hand on the rail and her whole body turned to ice, because she knew that knock she had heard it every day of her childhood. Her uncle knocked on doors with the head of his stick because he thought it beneath him to use his knuckles. She did not breathe. Below, the housemaid opened the door. "I'm looking for a young woman," said the voice she had spent 16 years trying to forget. Warmer than she remembered, oiled a gentleman's voice. "Gray gown, dark hair, employed here as a companion. I mean her no harm, quite the opposite. I believe she may be a relation of mine long lost. Reed, she calls herself. Is she within—" Eleanor's hand tightened on the rail until the wood bit her palm. He knew. Whatever he had failed to place across the ballroom, he had placed it since. He had come looking. He had stood in his fine coat at the door of a rented house and called himself her relation. Long lost. And Eleanor understood with total clarity that if she went down those stairs, she would not come back up them. That whatever her uncle had done to a 10-year-old girl, he would do worse to a grown woman who could ruin him with a word, and that his coming here, at all in person at dawn, meant he was afraid, and a frightened Silas was a dangerous one. "There's no Reed here, sir," the housemaid was saying. "You've the wrong house." "I think not. I've had her described to me most particular. Fetch your mistress." And Eleanor did the thing she had trained her whole life to do. She turned silent on the stairs and went up instead of down and out, the little window at the back of the upper landing onto the sloped roof of the scullery, and down the rain barrel to the yard. Her packed bag in her fist, her mother's glove sewn into the lining against her heart, and she was over the back fence and gone into the morning, while her uncle stood at the front door, insisting to Mrs. Halloway that he only wanted to help his poor lost niece. She heard later that Mrs. Halloway had sent him off with a flea in his ear. No such girl, and if there were, I'd not hand her to a man who comes knocking at dawn. The old woman had lied for her, had never asked why, had simply looked at Silas Whitcomb's oiled smile and disliked it enough to send him packing. Eleanor never saw her again, but she thought of her often after, and she came in time to understand that the first person to help her reclaim her name had been a cross old woman who owed her nothing and did it anyway for no better reason than that she knew the look of a woman running. She went to Dottie. She had sworn she never would. For 16 years, she had kept the old woman at arm's length precisely to keep her safe, had visited only twice years apart in secret, because to be seen with Dorothy Mercer was to draw a line straight back to Whitcomb Hall, and a drawn line could be followed. But there was nowhere else. There had never been anywhere else. And so Eleanor walked 2 days on back roads, sleeping in barns, spending Mrs. Halloway's coins, one at a time, until she came to the little house at the edge of a mill town, where her old nurse had lived out her years on a tiny pension that Eleanor Scrimping had sent in secret whenever she could. Dotty opened the door and took one look at her, and her seamed old face crumpled. "You've been seen," the old woman said. It was not a question. "Lord help us, child. Somebody's seen you." "He's found me, Dotty." Eleanor got the door shut behind her and put her back against it. "Silas. He came to the house himself. He called me his lost niece. He knows. Then it's time." Dotty was already moving faster than her old bones should have allowed to the corner where a battered work bag hung on a nail, the same bag she'd carried in and out of Whitcomb Hall for 30 years, mending linen that no thief and no magistrate had ever thought to search, because who searches an old servant's sewing? "It's past time. I've kept it 16 years, child. I've kept it through everything, and I near went to my grave with it unspoke." Kept what? The old woman's fingers were at the seam of the bag's lining, picking, tearing. "Your father was a careful man, more careful than that brother of his ever gave him credit for. He knew what Silas was. He always knew." The lining came away. "The night before your papa died, and he did not die easy, child, and I'll go to my Maker believing there was a hand in it, though. I've no proof, and never will. The night before he called me to his room, and he gave me this, and he said, 'Dotty, if anything happens to me, my brother will move quick, and he'll move on the will first, for the will's the whole of it.' And he made me swear." She drew it out. A folded paper yellowed soft at the creases from 16 years against the cloth, sealed with a blob of red wax gone brown with age. "There's the will he lodged with the lawyer, and Silas will have burned that, or bought it, one or the other, I don't doubt. But your papa was too clever for him. He had two made, two child. Signed the same day, witnessed the same day, both good in law. He kept the one, and he gave me the other, and he said, 'Keep it on. You keep it hid. And if the day ever comes that my Eleanor needs to prove who she is, you put it in her hand and no one else's.'" The old woman was weeping now freely, the tears running down into the creases of her face. "I'm putting it in your hand, child, 16 years late. Forgive me. It took a ball and a glove and that man near catching you to shake it loose. Here, it's yours. It was always yours." Eleanor took the paper. She did not open it at once. She stood with her back against the door and the folded will in both hands, and she felt the whole shape of her life tilt under her, 16 years of being nobody, and being safe, and wanting nothing. All of it built on the belief that there was no proof, that there had never been proof, that Eleanor Whitcomb was dead in law, and in fact, and could never be anything but Eleanor Reed, the gray companion, for the rest of her days. And here in her hands was the proof. Here was her name. She broke the wax. She read her father's will in the failing light of Dottie's one window, and it was all there. Her name, my beloved daughter. Eleanor. Grace Whitcomb. The whole of the estate, Whitcomb Hall and its lands and its incomes, entailed upon her absolutely with her uncle Silas, named only as guardian of her person, until her majority, and expressly in her father's own careful hand, forbidden to alienate, encumber, or profit from the estate during her minority under any circumstance whatsoever, my brother's habits being what they are. Her father had known. Her father had written it down. My brother's habits being what they are. Even dying, he had tried to build a wall around her, and Silas had simply gone around it, hidden. The child produced a death and taken the estate as heir at law to a dead niece instead of as guardian to a living one. And it hadn't worked, because Dottie had a second copy, because a dying man had trusted an old nurse over a lawyer. Eleanor sat down on the floor of the little house, right down on the bare boards, with the will in her lap, and for the second time in her adult life, she wept where someone could see her, and Dottie got down beside her with all the difficulty of her 73 years, and gathered her in, and held her and rocked her the way she had when Eleanor was small and frightened of storms, and said over and over, "There now, they didn't get you, child. All these years, and they didn't get you." "They think I'm dead," Eleanor said into the old woman's shoulder. "Everyone thinks I'm dead." "Then it's time you had a resurrection," Dottie said. "But we'll need help, child. Just the two of us, and a bit of paper against a man like that with his money and his friends and his lawyers. He'll say the will's forged. He'll say, I'm a mad old woman. He'll say, you're a fortune hunter who heard a story and dressed herself up in it. We'll need someone with standing, someone he can't just buy or frighten off." And Eleanor, still in the old woman's arms, went very still, because she knew exactly one man in the world with standing enough to stand against Silas Whitcomb. One man who owned half a county and answered to no one. One man who had already, without being asked, without being told a single true thing, spent 9 days and a boy in livery looking for a gray nobody who had begged him to forget her. "No," she said mostly to herself. "No, I can't. I told him to forget me. I begged him." "Told who, child? And it doesn't matter. I can't go to him. Don't you see, if I go to him, I have to tell him everything. And if I tell him everything, I put my whole life in the hands of a man I danced with twice. That's not standing on my own feet, Dottie. That's just trading one man's power over me for another's. Now you listen to me." Dottie took Eleanor's face in both her old hands and turned it up, and her rheumy eyes were suddenly hard. "Standing on your own feet is a fine thing, and I raised you to it, and I'm proud. But there's a difference, child, between standing on your own feet and standing alone in the road while the coach runs you down. Your papa didn't do it alone. He gave me the paper. He knew he couldn't hold that wall up by himself, so he built it 2 men thick. That's not weakness, that's sense. You take help where help is honest, and you keep your own hand on the reins, and there's no shame in it." She let go. Now, this man, is he honest? Eleanor thought of Nathaniel Ashford saying, "It's the only kind of power they've left me," with the smile going out of his face. Of him saying, "You're allowed your locked rooms." Of him closing his hand around her glove and telling his own mother no. "I don't know," she said. "I think so. I don't know how to tell anymore. I've been afraid so long I've forgotten how to know." She didn't go to him. He came to her. It took him 3 more weeks, and she never learned the whole of how he did it. Only that he'd started with the crest on the glove, had shown it to the half-blind old cousin who'd gone white, and named it, had gone from there, to the parish registers, to old wedding notices, to a lawyer's dusty ledgers, following the thread of a dead family back and back, until it snagged at last on the one loose end. No one had ever bothered to check that the girl who died of fever in 1800 had been buried in a closed coffin, and that the old nurse who'd laid her out had left the county the same week and had never once in 16 years come back to visit the small grave. He found Dottie's Milltown by finding Dottie, and he did not come with lawyers or livery or a boy calling her description in the square. He came alone on a plain horse in a plain coat, and he knocked at the door of the little house with his knuckles like an ordinary man. And when Dottie opened it, he took off his hat and said, "Ma'am, my name is Nathaniel Ashford, and I believe you nursed a child named Eleanor Whitcomb, and I believe against all sense and all report that she is alive, and I have come to return something that belongs to her. I'll go away and never trouble either of you again if she wishes it. But I had to know she was living. I've spent a year of my life now, a season that felt like a year, not able to stop wondering." Eleanor stood in the doorway of the back room, out of his sight, and heard him say it and pressed her bare hand flat against her heart. He held the glove out on his open palm. "I don't understand the whole of it," he said to Dottie, who had not moved, who was blocking the door with all 73 years of herself. "I understand almost none of it, but I understand that at my mother's ball, a woman looked at a man across the room, and I watched 16 years of fear go across her face all at once. And I've never in my life seen anything I couldn't stop wanting to know. She begged me to forget her. I tried. I'm not able. That's the whole truth, ma'am, and I know how it sounds, and I'll leave the glove and go if you tell me to." And Eleanor stepped out into the doorway where he could see her. He went still. The glove sat on his open hand between them. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, and then Nathaniel Ashford said very quietly, "You're real then. I'd half convinced myself I invented you. I told you to forget me." "Yes. You promised." "I did. I'm not a man who breaks promises, miss." He stopped. "I don't know what to call you. The glove says Whitcomb. The county says Whitcomb's dead. You said Reed. I don't know your name, and I've torn up half of Virginia looking for it." Eleanor looked at him, standing there in his plain coat, with her mother's glove on his palm. Having come alone, having come with nothing but the thing she'd lost, held out to give it back, and she made the decision that would remake her whole life. Made it the way she'd made every real decision she'd ever made, fast and quiet, and all at once. "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor Grace Whitcomb. And I'm not dead. My uncle only needed me to be." She told him everything. She sat him down at Dottie's little table, and she told him all of it, in order in her own flat, quiet voice. The study and the candle, the carriage and the hand over her mouth, the strange woman, the funeral she'd watched through a gap in the curtain, the 16 years of gray, the counting the exits. Dottie sat beside her and filled in the parts a 10-year-old couldn't have known, the parts an old nurse had watched from the servants' side of the house. And when it was told, Eleanor put her father's second will on the table between them, and Nathaniel read it in silence. And when he'd finished, he set it down very carefully, as though it might break, and he did not touch it again. And Eleanor understood something about him in that small gesture that she had not been sure of until then. "This is proof," he said. "Real proof in law. 2 wills, both valid. He can't have destroyed both. He'll say it's forged. Then we prove it isn't. Witnesses to the signing if they're living. The lawyer who drew it. Handwriting. It can be done." He was leaning forward now, and there was a light in him she hadn't seen at the ball the tired man come awake. "Eleanor, this is you can win this. You can walk into a court and walk out Eleanor Whitcomb of Whitcomb Hall, and there is nothing he can do about it. I know judges. I know lawyers who'd take this and never let go. I know every man in 3 counties who owes me a favor, and I have never once in my life called them in, and I would call in every last one of them for this. I'd—" "Stop." He stopped. "That," Eleanor said, "is exactly what I was afraid of." Her voice was steady, but her hands folded on the table had gone white at the knuckles. "You'd call in your favors. You'd bring your judges and your lawyers. You'd win it for me. And at the end of it, I'd have my name back, and I'd owe every inch of it to Nathaniel Ashford, and the whole county would say so, and I'd have traded a man who stole my life for a man who gave it back, and either way, it wouldn't be mine. Do you understand? I've been a thing that men do things to since I was 10 years old, kept sent away, buried, hunted. I will not—" Her voice cracked and she mastered it. "I will not be a thing that a man saves. Not even a kind one. Not even you." The silence stretched, and Nathaniel Ashford did the thing that decided her, the thing she measured him by for the rest of her life. He did not argue. He did not tell her she was being proud or foolish, or that she needed him whether she liked it or not. He sat back in Dottie's hard little chair, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly like a man rearranging everything he'd meant to say. "All right," he said. "Then tell me what you want, and I'll do that instead, and not one thing more. You'll do what I tell you." "Yes. And when I tell you to stop, you'll stop, even if you think I'm wrong, even if you think I'm walking into the coach in the road?" She saw him note the phrase, not knowing it was Dottie's, and let it pass. "This is my fight, my name. If I take your lawyers, I choose them. If I take your money, it's a loan, and I'll pay it back to the last penny out of my own estate when I have it. If I take your standing, it's because I asked for it, not because you decided I needed it. Those are my terms. Refuse any one of them, and I'll do it alone with a mad old woman and a bit of paper, and I'll likely lose, and I'll lose it standing up." Nathaniel Ashford looked at Eleanor Whitcomb across an old nurse's table, and something moved in his tired face that she would only much later have a name for. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "in 35 years, every soul I've ever met has wanted something from me. My land, my name, my favor, my money, a place at my table. You're the first person in my life to sit across from me and set out the terms on which you'll allow me to give." He almost smiled. "I accept. All of them. Your fight, your name, your terms. I'm only the hired man." He pushed the will back toward her across the table into her hands and no one else's. "Where do we start?" And Eleanor Whitcomb, who had begged this man to forget her 3 weeks ago, who had sworn she'd never let another soul hold power over her, who had spent 16 years wanting nothing at all, took her father's will back into her own 2 hands and looked at the man who'd handed it to her and felt for the first time since she was 10 years old. Something rise in her chest that was not fear. "We start with Silas," she said. "He came to the house himself. He's frightened. A frightened man makes mistakes." She folded the will and pressed it flat against her heart over the place where her mother's glove was sewn into the lining, and her voice when it came was low and level and did not shake at all. "He spent 16 years telling everyone I'm dead. Let's go and be alive at him. Let's see what a man does when the child he buried walks back up out of the ground and asks for her house." Across the little room, Dottie Mercer looked at the girl she'd raised, sitting straight-backed with her dead father's will over her living heart, and the old woman put her worn hands over her mouth, and this time the tears that came were not grief. "There she is," Dottie whispered. "There's the Whitcomb. 16 years, and there she is at last." Outside the light was going, and a plain horse waited at the gate, and somewhere up the James, a man in a fine coat sat at ease in a house that was not his, wearing a dead brother's ring on his fat finger, believing, as he had believed for 16 years, that the past was buried too deep to ever climb back out. He was wrong. She was already coming. Silas Whitcomb heard she was alive on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday he had stopped sleeping. It came to him the way bad news always came to men like him, sideways, through a servant in a whisper. His man of business rode up the James in a lather and stood in the study wringing his hat and said there was talk. Sir Ugly talk, that a woman had appeared at a lawyer's office in the county town, claiming to be the late Mr. Whitcomb's daughter, claiming the girl never died at all, claiming to have the old will. "That's a lie," Silas said. His voice came out steady. His hands did not. "The girl's dead. I buried her myself. Half the county stood at the grave." "Yes, sir. That's what I said, sir. Only what?" "Only she's got Ashford behind her. Nathaniel Ashford. His lawyers made the filing. And a man doesn't put his name to a fortune hunter, sir, not a man like that. People are wondering." And Silas Whitcomb, who had wept so prettily at a child's funeral 16 years ago, that the memory of his own performance sometimes moved him, even now felt the floor of his life shift under his feet for the first time since he was a young man. He did the arithmetics fast. He was good at arithmetic. It was the one honest thing about him. If the girl was alive, the death was a lie. If the death was a lie, the guardianship was a fraud. If the guardianship was a fraud, then every acre and every shilling he had spent 16 years enjoying belonged and had always belonged to her, and the taking of it was not inheritance but theft. And the burying of a living child was not grief but a crime that could put a rope around a gentleman's neck. He poured himself a drink, and his hand shook so badly he spilled it. Then he sent for Croft. Croft was the man Silas used for the things a gentleman could not be seen to do himself. A smooth, gray, quiet man with a lawyer's vocabulary and no lawyer's scruples, who had spent 20 years making inconvenient things go away for men who paid well. Silas told him the whole of it. Not the truth, of course, never the whole truth, but enough. A woman was making a false claim. An old servant had cooked up a forged document. It needed to stop before it reached a courtroom, because even a false claim dragged through open court would stain a respectable name. The old woman, Silas said. Mercer. She's the root of it. She's got no money and no protector, and she's near 80. Go and remind her what happens to poor old women who tell lies about their betters in a court of law. Frighten her quiet, that's all. Nothing that shows. And the young one? Leave the young one to me, Silas said. I'll deal with the young one myself. He believed when he said it that he could. Croft rode out the next morning to the mill town, to the little house at the edge of it, and he knocked at the door with a soft, gloved hand and put on his softest voice, and he was 3 sentences into it. Now, Mrs. Mercer, an old woman ought to think very careful about the company of ambitious young persons. The law is a hard place for the poor when the door swung wider, and it was not the old woman standing there at all. It was Eleanor. She had come to sit with Dottie precisely because she'd known they would send someone. A frightened man, she'd told Nathaniel, makes mistakes, and the first mistake a frightened Silas would make would be to reach for the weakest of them. So she'd been there 4 days waiting, and when the soft knock came, she'd sent Dottie to the back room and opened the door herself. Croft blinked. "I beg your pardon. I was told an old woman lived here. An old woman does. I'm the young one. I believe I'm the person you were sent to leave alone." Eleanor stepped out onto the threshold, and Croft, without meaning to, stepped back. "You're my uncle's man. You've come to frighten Dottie Mercer into silence. You may tell my uncle it won't answer. He's had 16 years of frightening people into silence, and it's brought him to a house that isn't his, and a ring that isn't his, and a name that won't be his much longer. Miss, I'm sure I don't know what you know exactly. Look at me." And Croft, against his own will, looked, and something in Eleanor's face made the practiced words dry up in his mouth. "You've frightened a great many people, I expect. It's your trade, so you'll know the look of someone who's frightened, and you'll know I haven't got it. I ran out of fear 3 weeks ago. There's none left. You can go back to Silas Whitcomb and tell him that. Tell him the child he put in a carriage 16 years ago with a hand over her mouth is grown now, and she's not a child anymore, and she's not afraid anymore, and she is coming not for revenge. Tell him I don't want his neck. I'm coming for what's mine. My name and my house. Tell him that, word for word. Can you remember it, or shall I write it down?" Croft, who had made hardened men go pale in his 20 years, found that his mouth was dry. "I'll remember it," he said. "Good. Then get off her step." He went. And that was the first mistake, because Croft was a coward at bottom, as all such men are, and he rode back up the James and gave Silas the message word for word, because he was more afraid of the woman who'd said it than of the man who'd sent him, and every word of it landed on Silas Whitcomb like a stone. The child he put in a carriage with a hand over her mouth. No one knew that. No one living knew that but Silas and the woman he'd paid to do it, and that woman was 10 years dead. If the girl knew that, if the girl remembered the carriage and the hand, then the girl was real. Was truly, the child was not some fortune hunter dressed in a dead girl's story, but the living article herself, and there was no forgery to expose, no impostor to unmask, nothing to frighten off. There was only his niece alive with her father's will, and Ashford's lawyers, and 16 years of patience walking up the James toward him. Silas Whitcomb sat alone in his brother's study that night under his brother's portrait, and for the first time he understood that he might lose. So he did the second thing frightened men do after threatening the weak fails. He went to bargain with the strong. He came to her. She'd known he would. She'd told Nathaniel so. He'll try to frighten Dottie, and when that fails, he'll come to me himself, because a man like Silas believes to his bones that everyone has a price, and he'll want to find mine before a courtroom does. Nathaniel had wanted to be there. She'd forbidden it. He came alone when he thought he had the power. He'll speak the truth to me alone that he'd never speak in front of a witness. Let him think I'm alone. Let him think I'm still frightenable. It's the only way he'll say the thing I need him to say. So when the carriage came up the lane to the little house, his own carriage, she noted the Whitcomb carriage. The very one, or one like enough it might have been, and something cold turned over in her. At the sight of it, Eleanor sent Dottie next door and met her uncle alone in the front room standing. He came in with his hat in his hand, and his face arranged into sorrow, and for one moment, one terrible moment, 16 years fell away and she was 10, and he was standing in the doorway of her father's study with a candle, and her whole body wanted to make itself small. She did not make herself small. She had done that for 16 years. She was finished. "Eleanor," Silas said, and his voice was thick, and she almost believed it. That was the horror of the man. He almost believed it himself. "Child, look at you. Grown, and living all this time. I can hardly—" "Don't," she said. "Don't do the weeping. I watched you do the weeping at my funeral through a gap in the carriage curtain. It was very good. You dabbed your eyes with a white handkerchief. I've never forgotten it. So don't waste it on me now, Uncle. I've seen the performance, I know how it ends." Silas's face went still. The sorrow ran off it like water. And underneath was the thing she remembered, the real thing, cold and quick and calculating, and it was almost a relief to see it, because at least it was true. "You've grown hard," he said. "I've grown up. There's a difference, though. I don't expect you'd know it. Say what you came to say." He set his hat down. He walked to the window and stood a moment with his back to her, a man gathering himself, choosing his ground. "You mean to take me to court?" "I mean to take back my house. The court's only the road there." "You'll lose." "Perhaps." "You will. I've money and standing and 40 years of friends on the bench and in the county, and you've an old servant and a scrap of paper, and a rich man who'll tire of you the day the novelty wears thin. You drag me into open court, girl, and I'll break you. I'll say the will's forged. I'll say Mercer's senile. I'll say you're a bastard got on some servant and coached to it by Ashford for the sport of ruining an old family. I'll make it so ugly that whatever the verdict, you'll wish you'd stayed dead." He turned. Or we're reasonable. You're my brother's child. I've a fondness for you, whatever you think. There's money, a great deal of money, and I'd see you comfortable, handsomely comfortable. A house of your own far off, and an income for life, and my blessing, and no ugliness, no court, no dragging the family name through the dirt. You take the money, and you keep the name Reed, and you let the Whitcombs rest in their graves where the county thinks they are. Everyone lives. Everyone's comfortable. He spread his soft hands. "What's a name, Eleanor?" "A name's nothing. I'm offering you a life." And Eleanor looked at her uncle, offering to buy back the house he'd stolen with the incomes he'd stolen from it, and she understood fully for the first time exactly what he was. Not a monster. Monsters were rare, but something commoner, and worse, a frightened, greedy man who had done a monstrous thing once and spent 16 years telling himself it had been reasonable. "You keep saying the name's nothing," she said. "You've said it 3 times. If it's nothing, Uncle, why have you spent 16 years and a great deal of money making sure it stayed buried? A man doesn't guard nothing that hard." Silas said nothing. "I don't want your money." She went on quiet, steady, and she watched him understand that this was the one thing he had no answer for a person who could not be bought. "I've been poor 16 years, and it didn't kill me. I don't want your neck either. You'll not believe that. But it's true, I've no use for revenge. It's just another cage, and I've been caged enough. I want one thing. I want my name back, and my house back, and I want it in open court, where the whole county can hear, so that no man can ever again put me in a carriage and tell the world I'm dead." She took one step toward him. "But before any of that, Uncle, I want you to say it. Just once. To me. In this room, where it's only us, and you needn't perform for anyone. I want to hear you say it in your own voice. Say what? Did you burn my father's will?" The room went very quiet. Silas Whitcomb looked at his niece, and she watched the calculation run behind his eyes, the man weighing it even now, even here, whether there was some angle, some profit, some safety in the lie. And she watched him arrive at the thing that men like him always finally arrive at, which is the belief that a private confession costs nothing, that words spoken with no witness are words that were never spoken at all. "Yes," he said. It was so quiet she almost missed it. "The one he lodged with Harkness," Silas said, and now that it was started, something in him seemed almost to want it out, 16 years of it. "The lawyer. I paid Harkness for it, and I burned it in this very great number. Not this great, the study great, at the hall. I burned it the week after your father died, before the ink was cold on the death notice. I thought that was the end of it. I never dreamed there were 2. Careful, Robert. Careful to the last." He said his dead brother's name with something that was almost admiration and almost hatred. "And the child I never meant, it was only meant to be a few years. Send you off, let the estate settle, bring you back, when I told myself I'd bring you back. I told myself a great many things. You told the world I was dead. It was cleaner," Silas said, and there it was, the whole of him in 3 words. The thing that made him what he was, that a lie was permissible if it was cleaner. A missing ward, there's questions. A dead niece, there's sympathy. I chose sympathy. He looked at her, and for one moment there was something in his face that might, in a better man, have been shame. I did you a great wrong, Eleanor. I'll not pretend otherwise, not here, not to your face. But I'll fight you to the last acre all the same, because I'm an old man, and I've no life left but this one, and a man will do a great deal to keep the only life he's got. So take the money. I'm begging you. Take the money and let us both live. And Eleanor stood in the little front room, and had at last the thing she'd come for the confession in his own voice, whole and clear. She had it, and now she needed only to get out of the room and set it down and bring it to a court. No, she said, I won't take the money. Goodbye, Uncle. I'll see you in the county court. Silas's face closed like a door. Then God help you, he said, because I won't. And he took up his hat and left her standing there, and the carriage rattled away down the lane, and Eleanor stood alone in the quiet, and let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 16 years. She turned, and Nathaniel Ashford was standing in the doorway of the back room. She had not forbidden him hard enough, or he had disobeyed her the one time, the only time. He'd come in the night before and hidden himself in the back room with Dottie, and he'd heard the whole of it through the thin wall, the offer, the threat, the confession, all of it. You gave me your word, she said, and her voice shook, but not with fear this time. You said you'd do what I told you. I told you not to come. I know. You gave me your word, Nathaniel. I know I did. He came into the room slowly, his hat in his hands, and he did not look like a man making excuses. He looked like a man who'd done a thing he knew he'd have to answer for, and meant to answer for it honestly. And you can be as angry as you like, and you'd be right to, and if you tell me to leave and never come back, I'll go. But I want you to hear why first, and then you can decide. He set his hat down where Silas had set his. You told me this was your fight, and it is, and I meant every word of what I promised. But I sat in that back room, and I listened to that man threaten to call you a bastard and a fraud in open court, to make it so ugly you'd wish you'd stayed dead. And I thought, if I keep my word and stay away, and he does to you in a courtroom what he just did in this room, and there's no one to say I heard him confess, I heard it with my own ears, then I kept my word and I lost you your case. So I broke it. Once. On purpose. And I'll break it again the same way if it's ever a choice between my word and your name, because I'd rather have you alive and free and furious at me than safe in my promises and beaten in that court. Eleanor stared at him. You heard him confess, she said slowly. Every word. Yes, I burned it in the study grate. It was cleaner. Nathaniel's jaw was tight. I'm a witness now, Eleanor. Not a rich man lending his name to your cause, a witness who heard Silas Whitcomb admit to burning your father's will and faking your death. He can't buy that, and he can't frighten it, and he can't call it senile. You wanted a confession in his own voice with no witness, so he'd say it freely. A muscle moved in his cheek. He said it freely. And there was a witness. He just didn't know it. You built the trap. I only made sure it had teeth. And Eleanor Whitcomb stood in the little front room, torn clean down the middle, furious that he'd broken his word, understanding exactly why he had, hating that it had worked, unable to deny that it had worked, and she realized that this was the thing she was going to have to learn if she let this man into her life, that he would keep every promise he made her, but one, and the one he'd break, would always be the one where keeping it meant watching her walk into the coach in the road. Don't ever do it again, she said. Her voice was unsteady. Not ever. The next time you decide you know better than me, what I can survive, you'll be wrong, and it'll cost me everything. And if I promise that, will you believe me, given I just broke the last one? No, she said, but I'll take it anyway. On terms. You're a witness now, fine. You'll testify to exactly what you heard, no more, no color, no helping it along. You won't decide what I need. You won't manage me. You heard him confess, so you'll say so, and that's the end of what you do without asking me first. Agreed. Agreed. Say it like you mean it, because if you break this one, I'll do the rest alone, and you'll read about it in the county paper. I mean it, Nathaniel said. Your fight. Your name. I heard a confession and I'll say so under oath and past that I don't move unless you tell me to move. On my life, Eleanor." She held his eyes a moment longer, and then she nodded once, and something in the room eased, and Dottie, who had been standing in the back doorway the whole while, watching the two of them go at each other like flint and steel, said dryly, "Well, if you two are done, there's a case to build, and I've made tea." They took it to court in the autumn. Silas did exactly what he'd promised he'd do. His lawyers stood up in the county court and called the will a forgery, called Dottie Mercer. A senile old woman coached to her lines called Eleanor a fortune hunter. And worse, the thing Silas had threatened in the little front room. They stood up in open court and suggested she was no Whitcomb at all. But some byblow got on a servant dressed up in a dead girl story by a rich man for his amusement, and the whole packed courtroom drew breath at it, and Eleanor sat very still and let it wash over her, and did not flinch because she had heard it all already in a little front room from the man himself, and she had known it was coming, and a blow you see coming lands soft. Then it was her turn, and she walked to the witness box in a plain dark gown, not gray. She'd burned the gray, but not fine either, plain and clean and her own, and she took the oath in a voice that carried to the back of the room, and she told the truth. She did not weep. She did not rage. She told it the way she'd told Nathaniel at Dottie's table, flat and quiet, and in order, and it was the quiet that undid them. A woman who did not perform her grief, who simply laid the facts down one after another, like a person setting the table, the study, and the candle, the carriage, and the hand over her mouth. The funeral watched through a gap in the curtain the 16 years. And when Silas's lawyer rose to tear at her, to trip her, to trap her in a lie, he found there was nothing to trip because she was not lying, and there is no cross-examination on earth that can shake a person who is simply telling what happened to them. "You claim to remember a carriage," the lawyer said, silky certain. "At 10 years old. A hand over your mouth. Convenient is it not that your evidence rests on the memory of a frightened child 16 years gone, which no one can confirm or deny?" "Someone can confirm it," Eleanor said. The lawyer smiled. "Oh, and who might that be? The woman in the carriage is conveniently dead, I'm told." "My uncle can confirm it," Eleanor said. "He told me the whole of it 3 weeks ago in a house at the edge of a mill town when he came to offer me money to stay dead. He told me he burned my father's will in the study grate the week after the funeral. He told me he chose to report me dead rather than missing because a dead niece brings sympathy, and a missing ward brings questions, and he said his words that it was cleaner. Ask him. He'll deny it. But ask him under oath and watch his face, and then ask the gentleman who heard every word of it through the wall." The courtroom erupted. Silas was on his feet, white, shouting that it was a lie, that he'd never, that no such conversation, and his own lawyer was pulling at his sleeve to sit him down, and the judge was hammering for order. And through all of it, Nathaniel Ashford rose from the body of the court quiet and certain and said, "Your Honor, I was in the back room of that house. I heard the whole of it. I'll swear to every word." And it was the fact that Silas had stood up shouting the fact that he'd risen white, and denying before anyone had even named the witness before he could possibly have known who'd heard, unless there had been something to hear, that turned the last doubtful faces in the room. An innocent man is puzzled by a lie. Only a guilty one is terrified by the truth. Dottie testified steady as a rock and produced the second will and told how a dying man had sewn his daughter's whole future into a servant's work bag because he trusted an old nurse over a bought lawyer. The lawyer who'd drawn both wills was found old, now retired, but alive, and he remembered the day. Remembered Robert Whitcomb saying, "My brother's habits being what they are." Nathaniel testified to the confession, plain and exact, no color, no helping it along, exactly as she'd made him promise. And last of all, the white glove was laid on the table before the court, the faded crest at its cuff, and the half-blind old cousin who'd first named it swore that it was the true Whitcomb device, and that such gloves had been made for one wedding, only the wedding of Robert Whitcomb, and his bride 30 years gone, and had never been made again. The court turned. It turned the way a tide turns all at once and past stopping. Silas Whitcomb sat in the dock with his face gone gray and old, and watched 16 years come apart in an afternoon, and he did not weep this time. He had no performance left. There was no one to perform for. The county he'd bought and charmed and dined for 40 years sat in the pews behind him and looked at the back of his neck, and he could feel every eye of them, and he understood that whatever the verdict said, he was already finished. That a man who buries a living child does not get his good name back, not ever. Not if he lives to be 100. The verdict, when it came, was almost an afterthought. Eleanor Grace Whitcomb, the court found, was legitimate, was the sole and rightful heir of Robert Whitcomb under a valid will, and had been fraudulently deprived of her name and her inheritance for 16 years by her guardian Silas Whitcomb, who had suppressed the true will and falsely reported her death. The estate was hers. Whitcomb Hall was hers. Her name was hers. She did not cry out. She did not fall into anyone's arms. She sat in her plain, dark gown, with her hands folded in her lap, and she let the words settle over her, one at a time, living legitimate rightful hers, and the only sign of what it cost her was that when she finally rose to leave the court, a free woman under her own true name, her hand went without her telling it to the place over her heart, where 16 years ago a strange woman had pressed her mother's gloves into her small, cold fists and told her to hide them and never tell a soul where they came from. She had told, at last in open court, before the whole county she had told. And no one had put a hand over her mouth. She came home to Whitcomb Hall on a morning in early summer, and it nearly broke her. She had thought she was ready. She'd told herself on the ride up the James with Dottie beside her, and Nathaniel a length behind on his plain horse, that a house was only a house wood and stone and glass, that she'd carried the true home inside her all these years, in a glove sewn against her heart, and that walking back into Whitcomb Hall would be a triumph, and nothing more. She was wrong about that the way she'd been wrong about the glove, because the gate was the same. That was the first thing that undid her, the iron gate at the foot of the drive with the same twist of ironwork at the top that she'd stared at through a gap in a carriage curtain 16 years ago, while a strange woman's hand pressed over her mouth. She'd looked at that gate the last time as it shrank behind her. Now it grew before her, and her hands went cold on the reins, and she had to stop the horse and sit a moment and count. 4 in, hold, 4 out. Take your time, child, Dottie said quietly. It's not going anywhere. It waited 16 years. It'll wait 4 breaths more. I thought it would be easier than this. The winning's always easier than the coming home. The winning's a thing you do with your head. The coming home's a thing that happens to your heart, and the heart don't take orders. The old woman looked up the drive at the house rising gray and familiar at the end of it. Go on when you're ready, not before. Eleanor went when she was ready and not before. They had cleared the house of him already. Silas was gone, had left the day after the verdict, gone to a married sister in another state who would have him, because blood is blood, gone with 2 trunks and no servants, and not one soul in the county to see him off. And the last anyone saw of him, he was a gray old man alone in a hired carriage, and no one waved. Eleanor had not pressed for prison. She could have. The lawyers told her she could have fraud, false report of death, the suppression of a will. There was enough there to see an old man die behind bars. Nathaniel had gone carefully quiet when the subject came up, careful not to push her, careful to make it her decision, the way he'd sworn he would, and she'd known he'd have done it. Would have chased Silas into a cell with every lawyer he owned if she'd asked, and she'd thought about it. She'd sat with it a whole night, and in the morning she'd said no. He'll think it's mercy, Dottie had warned her. A man like that, you let him walk, he'll tell himself you were weak. He'll die still thinking he half won. Let him, Eleanor had said. I'm not doing it for him. I've spent 16 years being a thing that man did something to. If I chase him into a prison cell, I spend another 16 years being a woman doing something to him. I stay tied to him. I let him be the center of my life a while longer. I let the last thing I built be a cage with his name on it. I won't. He's not worth the room he'd take up in the rest of my life. Let him go be nothing somewhere else to someone else. I've got a house to fill. And that had been the end of Silas Whitcomb in her life. At least not a scaffold, not a cell, just a door closing quietly on a man who was already in every way that mattered, dead in the county that had loved him. It was, she thought, the harder punishment and the cleaner one. He'd spent 16 years buying a place at every good table in Virginia. Now there wasn't a table in the state that would set him a place. She'd left him alive to know it. That was enough. So the house was empty of him when she walked into it. But it was full of everything else. She'd braced for the strangeness. She had not braced for the familiarity, which was worse. Her feet knew the house. That was the thing that took the breath out of her. 16 years gone, a grown woman now, where a child had been, and still her feet turned left at the bottom of the stair without her telling them to. Still her hand went out to a particular newel post worn smooth by 3 generations of Whitcomb hands. Still she knew without looking that the 3rd stair from the top would creak and the 4th would not. Her mind had forgotten almost everything. Her body had forgotten nothing. She found her father's study last on purpose because she'd known it would be the hardest. She stood in the doorway of it a long time before she went in the doorway where a man had stood with a candle, though which man, her father or her uncle. She could no longer be sure the two had run together in 16 years of remembering. The desk was still there. The portrait of her father still hung over the mantel, and she stood beneath it and looked up at the painted face of the careful man who had made 2 wills because he'd known his brother to the bone, who had sewn her whole future into a servant's work bag, who had tried from beyond the grave to build a wall around a daughter he must have known he was leaving. "You knew," she said to the portrait out loud alone. "You knew what he was, and you knew you were dying, and you did everything a dying man could do." It nearly wasn't enough. It came down to a bit of paper in an old woman's sewing bag. Her voice thickened. "But it was enough. It was enough, Papa. I'm home." And there in the grate, that grate, the study grate, the one Silas had named in the little front room, she saw the old scorch mark 16 years faded, but still there in the stone where a frightened, greedy man had burned a dead brother's will the week after the funeral and told himself it was cleaner. She had a fire laid in that grate that same evening, and she sat before it the first night in her own house under her own name and watched it burn clean and bright over the old scorch mark, and it was not lost on her that the same hearth that had destroyed the proof of her had now at last warmed her home. She thought her father would have liked that. He'd had a careful man's sense of things coming round. The county came, of course. It could not stay away. That was the part she'd expected least, and liked least, that the same families who had murmured behind their fans at the Ashford ball, who had known Silas Whitcomb for 40 years, and dined at his table, and never once wondered aloud what had really become of his brother's child, now came up the drive of Whitcomb Hall in their good carriages to pay their respects to Miss Eleanor, Whitcomb restored heiress, the girl who came back from the dead. They came with cards and cakes and careful smiles, and Eleanor received them with a still face and perfect courtesy, and gave them nothing at all. "You could freeze a river with that face," Nathaniel told her after the 3rd such carriage had rattled away down the drive. He'd taken to riding over most days, not staying, never staying, always leaving before dark, careful of her name and her freedom both. And he'd watched her receive the Vanes with a politeness so cold it had sent them off in under 20 minutes. "That was Caroline Vane's mother. She'll tell everyone you're proud." "I am proud." Eleanor set down the untouched cake the woman had brought. Those people knew Silas 40 years. Some of them must have wondered. A brother's only child dead of a convenient fever, buried in a closed coffin, and the estate falling clean to the uncle, and not one of them ever asked a question out loud, because Silas set a fine table, and asking questions is rude. They let it happen, Nathaniel, not by doing anything, by doing nothing, by deciding it was more comfortable not to wonder. She looked at the door the Vanes had gone out of. "I'll be civil to them. I'll never trust one of them. There's a difference, and I mean to keep it my whole life. That's a lonely way to live." "I know how to be lonely," Eleanor said. "I've had practice. It's being surrounded by people who wish you well that I've never learned." And then, because it had come out harder than she'd meant, she added quieter, "Present company accepted. You never wished me well. You just wouldn't leave me alone. It's turned out to be the same thing, but it started honester." He almost smiled at that. "Is that a thank you? It's as close to one as you'll get today. Don't press your luck." But the county's opinion, she found, was the least of it, because the county's opinion could be met at the door and sent away with cake uneaten. The thing that could not be sent away, the thing that came up on her in the quiet hours when the carriages were gone and the house was still, was the grief. She had not expected grief. She'd expected triumph, and gotten it, and found it thinner than she'd hoped. She'd expected relief, and gotten that too. What she had not expected was to walk through her own restored house. Her name cleared her enemy, routed her future secure, and be ambushed at every turn by the size of what could not be given back. Because the house was hers again, but her father was still dead. The verdict could restore an estate. It could not restore a man. She would never hear his voice. She had. She realized one evening, standing before his portrait, lost even the memory of his voice. 16 years had worn it clean away, and she could see the painted face, but not hear the living one, and no court in the world could give her back the sound of her own father saying her name. And her mother. Her mother was worse because her mother, she'd never really had at all. A portrait in the long gallery, a pair of white gloves, a device embroidered on a cuff. That was the whole of her mother. Eleanor had won back a house full of her mother's things, and could not remember her mother's face without the painting to prompt it. She stood in the gallery one afternoon and looked up at the painted woman in the white gloves. Her gloves, the pair, one of them sewn against Eleanor's own heart these 16 years, and she understood that the deepest theft Silas had committed was not the house or the money, or even the 16 years. It was that he had made her a stranger to her own dead. "I got it all back," she said to Dottie that night, and for once her voice was not steady at all. "The house, the name, the land, all of it. And it turns out the things I wanted most were never in his power to take or give. My father's voice, my mother's face, my childhood. He took those too, and no court can order them returned, because they're not property. They're just gone, burned. Like the will in the grate, only there's no second copy." She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "I keep waiting to feel like I won. And I don't. I feel like I dug up a grave and found it was the wrong one, and the thing I was looking for was never in the ground at all." And Dottie, 73 years old and near the end of her long road, took the grown woman she'd raised into her arms the way she had when Eleanor was small and let her weep, and did not tell her it would pass, because it would not pass. Not entirely, not ever. "Now you know the last thing," the old woman said softly into Eleanor's hair. "The thing nobody tells you about justice, child, because if they told you, you might not chase it, and you should chase it anyway. Winning it back don't undo the taking. It never does. Your papa's still dead. Your childhood's still gone. All the winning did all it ever does is stop the wrong from going on. That's not nothing. Lord, child, that's not nothing. You've stopped it. He'll never do to another soul what he did to you. The wound's still there, but the knife's stopped. That's the whole of what justice is, and it's less than you wanted, and it's more than most folks ever get, and you'll learn in time to be grateful for the size of it." Eleanor pulled back and looked at her old nurse. "When did you get so wise?" "Same time I got so old," Dottie said. "They come together more's the pity. You'd rather have the wisdom young and the knees old, but the Lord don't take requests." She wiped Eleanor's face with her thumb, the same gesture she'd used on a 10-year-old a lifetime ago. "You did right, child, all of it. Even the mercy on Silas, especially that. You'll not believe me now, but that mercy wasn't for him. It was for you. You'll thank yourself for it 20 years on when he's dead and forgotten and you're not still carrying him." It was the last real conversation they had. Dottie died 3 weeks later in high summer in a good bed in Whitcomb Hall, with the windows open and the smell of the roses coming in, died in the house she had helped to restore, having lived against all the odds of her age and her hard years just long enough to see it done. She went easy in her sleep after a good day. She'd sat in the sun that afternoon and told Eleanor a long story about Robert Whitcomb as a young man courting the girl in the white gloves so shy he could barely get his words out, and she'd laughed telling it, and that night she did not wake. Eleanor found her in the morning, and she did not weep. At first, she was too emptied out for weeping 16 years, and a court case, and a homecoming, and now this all of it landing at once. She only sat on the edge of the bed, and held the old cold hand and said, "You waited. You held on 16 years, and you would not go until you'd put the paper in my hand and seen me home. You stubborn, faithful old woman, you waited on purpose." And it was true, and she knew it was true, and it was the truest kind of love she had ever been given, a love that had refused to die until its work was done. She buried Dottie in the Whitcomb plot. It caused talk, of course. A servant, the county murmured. An old nurse laid in the family ground among the Whitcombs themselves. It wasn't done. It wasn't fitting. What was the girl thinking? Eleanor heard the murmurs and did not care for them. One particle. She had the stone cut deep and plain, and she wrote on it, not servant and not nurse, but the truth. The whole truth, the only truth that mattered. Dorothy Mae Mercer, she kept faith when all others stayed silent. "That'll set the county talking for a year," Nathaniel said, standing beside her at the graveside after the others had gone. He hadn't left this time. He'd stayed the whole long day quiet at the edge of things, close enough to reach if she needed him, and far enough not to crowd. A servant in the family plot. She was never a servant, Eleanor said. She was the only family I had for 16 years. She's more Whitcomb than half the Whitcombs under that grass, and every soul in this county can talk about it till their tongues wear out, and I'll not move her a single inch. She looked down at the deep-cut stone. You know what she said to me near the end. She said the mercy I showed Silas wasn't for him, it was for me. That I'd thank myself for it 20 years on. I didn't believe her. She was quiet a moment. I believe her now. I've been standing here half the day, and I haven't thought of Silas once till just this minute. If I'd sent him to a cell, I'd think of him every day. I'd have to. Instead, I've got a whole afternoon to give to Dottie, and not a scrap of it owed to him. She was right. She was right about everything the whole way through for 16 years, and I only ever half listened. You listened when it counted. I did, but I'd give a great deal to have another afternoon of her being right at me. Eleanor's voice caught finally, and she let it. I keep thinking she should be here to see the rest of it, whatever the rest of it is. She got me home, and then it feels like she read me to the last chapter and closed the book before we found out how it ends. Nathaniel was quiet a moment. Then he said carefully in the tone of a man who has thought hard about whether he's allowed to say a thing at all. Maybe she didn't close it before the end. Maybe she closed it because she'd seen enough of the end to know it'd come out right, and she trusted the rest of us to finish it without her. Eleanor turned and looked at him. It was the closest either of them had come in all these months to naming the thing that stood between them, and would not be named the thing that had started at a ball and run through a manhunt and a courtroom and a homecoming. The thing that had made a lonely rich man tear up half of Virginia for a gray nobody. The thing that had made a woman who trusted no one come to trust one man enough to build her whole freedom on his word. It stood there in the churchyard between them in the summer light over an old woman's fresh grave, and neither of them touched it. Don't, Eleanor said, but it came out soft. I'm not, Nathaniel said. I told you at Dottie's table I'd not move unless you told me to move. I meant it then, and I mean it now at a graveside more than anywhere. I'm only saying she knew. Dottie, whatever it is that's here and hasn't got a name yet, that old woman knew about it months ago, and it made her easy, I think, at the end. It was one less thing to worry over. That's all I'm saying. I'll not say a word more till you tell me I can. And Eleanor stood over the grave of the woman who had raised her in the house, and the ground of the family that had been stolen and returned under her own true name at last. And she looked at the man who had refused to leave her alone, until refusing to leave her alone had somehow turned into the only steady thing in her whole broken and mended life. And she felt the thing in her chest that was not fear and not grief, and she was beginning to understand, only ever had one name. She was not ready to say it, not here, not yet. Grief and love were too close together in her this day, and she would not let the one be mistaken for the other, would not reach for a living man across a fresh grave, just because the grave had left her wanting something warm to hold. She had spent her whole life being careful. She would be careful in this too. When she said it, if she said it, it would be because she'd chosen it clear-eyed and free and whole, not because she was lonely and afraid of the empty house and he happened to be standing near. "Not yet," she said. "Not here. Do you understand? It's not no. It's not yet. There's a difference, and I need you to hear it, because I've spent my whole life not being able to want things, and I'll not fumble the first real thing I've wanted by grabbing it out of grief. When I come to you, if I come to you, I'll come whole, or I won't come at all. I've waited a season that felt like a year," Nathaniel said quietly. "I can wait for whole. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. That's the one thing you can build on Eleanor. Whatever else you can't. I'm not going anywhere." They walked back up to the house together, not touching a proper foot of summer air between them. And Eleanor thought that the foot of air was its own kind of promise, the kind she could trust a man who wanted her, and would not reach, who had waited a season, and would wait a year, who had sworn not to move until she told him to, and had kept that word even standing over the grave of the one person who might have blessed the moving. The house rose gray and familiar at the end of the drive. Hers now empty, now of everyone but her, and she stopped at the gate. That gate, the iron gate with the twist of ironwork she'd watched shrink behind a carriage 16 years ago, and she put her hand on it and it was warm from the sun. "I used to look at this gate," she said through the curtain, while she held my mouth shut. "I watched it get smaller and smaller, and I thought I'd never see it again from the inside." Her hand tightened on the warm iron. "And here I am on the inside of it, and the woman who held my mouth is dead, and the man who sent the carriage is gone, and the woman who kept the paper is in the ground with her name cut deep, and I'm standing at my own gate in the summer sun with my hand on the iron, and no one on this earth has a hand over my mouth." She let out a long breath. "It took 16 years, but I can say anything I want now out loud as I please, and there's not a soul living can stop me." "Then say something," Nathaniel said. "Anything, the first free thing. Say it loud." And Eleanor Whitcomb stood at her own gate in her own name on her own land and lifted her chin and said the first free thing that came to her, not to him, not to the county, not to the dead, but to the whole wide summer evening and the God who'd let her live to see it. "I'm here," she said, loud, clear, ringing off the iron and the stone and the gathering dusk. "I'm Eleanor Grace Whitcomb, and I'm not dead and I'm home, and I'll never be quiet again as long as I live." The words rolled out across the lawn, and the drive and the fields beyond, out over Dottie's fresh grave, and her father's old one, out past the gate she'd once watched shrink to nothing, and no one put a hand over her mouth, and no one ever would again. Winter came, and then another spring, and Eleanor Whitcomb learned how to live in a house that was hers. It did not come easy. Nothing had ever come easy to her, and this least of all, because a woman who has spent 16 years wanting nothing does not learn to want in a season. She caught herself those first months still doing the old things, still counting the exits in every room, still folding her hands and lowering her chin when a carriage came up the drive. Still, God help her, waking before dawn to lay a fire she had servants now to lay because her hands did not believe yet that she was allowed to sleep while others worked. "You'll drive the staff to distraction," her housekeeper told her, a plain-spoken woman named Mrs. Bell, whom Eleanor had hired precisely because she'd looked her in the eye at the interview instead of at the floor. "They don't know what to do with a mistress who lays her own fires and won't be waited on. It shames them, ma'am, if you'll pardon me. They think you find them wanting." "I don't find them wanting." "Then let them do their work. It's how they eat, ma'am. A mistress who does everything herself is a mistress who needs no staff, and a house that needs no staff is a house full of folk about to lose their places. You keep laying your own fires, you'll frighten every soul under this roof." Mrs. Bell folded her arms. "Sit down of a morning and let someone bring you your tea. It's not weakness, it's how a house works. You're not the frightened girl anymore, ma'am. You're the reason 40 people have work. Act like it for their sake, if not your own." And Eleanor, who had learned her hardest lessons from plain-spoken women from Mrs. Halloway, who'd given her a month's wages and lied to Silas at the door. From Dottie, who'd kept faith 16 years, took the lesson from Mrs. Bell too, and learned slowly to sit still of a morning and let herself be brought tea. It was one of the hardest things she ever did. It was harder than the courtroom. In the courtroom, she'd only had to be brave. Here she had to be still and let herself be cared for and trust that the caring would not turn at the last moment into a hand over her mouth. Nathaniel came all that winter and all that spring, never staying, always careful. He'd ride over 2 or 3 days in a week, and they'd walk the grounds or sit in the study under her father's portrait, or ride out to look at the far fields where the tenants were bringing in the first crops that had come to Eleanor's hand instead of Silas's, and they'd talk. That was the thing that surprised her most in the end. Not that she came to want him, but that she came to like him, which was rarer and took longer and mattered more. He was funny in a dry, buried way that took her weeks to dig out. He was clever about the land and taught her things without ever once making her feel taught. And he had a grief of his own. She learned a whole hidden country of it. A man who'd been valued his whole life for his fortune, and never once for himself, who'd grown a hard-bored shell, precisely because it was safer than hoping anyone would look past the money, and who had looked across his mother's ballroom one summer night and seen a woman in gray who plainly did not care about his fortune at all, because she had a terror far bigger than any fortune sitting on her face, and it had cracked his shell clean open. "You want to know the truth of why I couldn't stop looking for you," he said one evening in the study, the fire low. "It wasn't the mystery. I told myself it was the mystery for months. It wasn't." He turned his glass in his hand. "It was that you were the first person in my whole life who looked at me at that ball and didn't want a single thing from me. Every soul I'd ever met wanted my land or my name or my favor. You wanted me to go away. You wanted me to forget you. You begged me for it. Do you know what that's worth to a man who spent 35 years being wanted for his purse, a woman who'd have given anything for me to leave her be?" He almost laughed. "I fell in love with you because you didn't want me. It's the most backward thing I've ever done, and I don't regret 1 minute of it." "That's a poor foundation," Eleanor said. "Loving me because I didn't want you. What happens now that I—" She stopped. She had come very close to the edge of the thing, and she stepped back from it, but they both heard where the sentence had been going. "Now that you what?" Nathaniel said. Very quiet, not moving, keeping even now to the terms she'd set at a graveside almost a year ago. "I'll not move unless you tell me to move." "Nothing," she said. "Not yet." "Not yet." He agreed and let it go. And it was the letting go that told her more than any pushing ever could have that she was going to say it someday soon. The summons, when it came from an unexpected quarter. A letter arrived in early summer, a year near enough to the day from the ball where it had all begun, and it was from Silas. Eleanor recognized the hand on the outside and nearly threw it in the fire unopened. Then she didn't. She sat with it a long while, and then she opened it because she had promised herself a year ago that she would never again be a woman who was afraid to see what was in front of her. He was dying. That was the whole of it under the careful gentleman's phrases. He was old and ill, and dying in his sister's house in another state, and he wrote, been thinking on his life as a dying man does, and he wished he did not ask. He was too proud to ask. But he wished to see her once before the end. To say a thing to her face. He did not say what thing. "You won't go," Nathaniel said when she showed him. His voice was tight in a way she'd rarely heard it. "Tell me you won't go." He put a hand over a child's mouth. "He buried you alive in the eyes of the whole county. He'd have called you a bastard in open court to keep his stolen acres. Eleanor, he does not get to summon you to his deathbed for absolution. He does not get to make you the last kind face he sees so he can die easy. That's not repentance. That's one final theft. He wants to steal your forgiveness to comfort himself, and you owe him nothing less than nothing." He caught himself, stopped, set his jaw. "There. I've done it again. I've told you what to do. I'm sorry." It's your decision. It was always your decision. But I'll not pretend I've no feeling about it because I've a great deal of feeling about it, and you'd know I was lying if I said otherwise. I know you have feeling about it. Eleanor looked at the letter. You're right about all of it too. It's not repentance. He wants to die easy, and he's found the one person whose forgiveness would let him, and he's reaching for me one last time, exactly the way he reached for me at Dottie's, with the money a man grabbing at the thing that'll comfort him and calling it love. She folded the letter. And I'm not going to give it to him. Good, but I'm not going to refuse it out of hate either. That's the part you've got wrong. She looked up. You want me to refuse him to punish him, and if I refuse him to punish him, then he's still got his hand on the reins of my life, hasn't he? I'm still doing things because of Silas, still building my choices around him, still letting that man be the compass I steer by. I did that once already this whole past year when I chose not to send him to prison. Dottie told me why, and she was right. I'll not go back on it now. She set the letter aside. I won't go to him. Not because I hate him, I don't. I've not got the energy left to hate him. Hate takes more than he's worth. I won't go because there's nothing there for me. He wants to give me his death like it's a gift. It's not a gift. It's just the last of his taking. And I've got better things to do with the summer than watch a thief die. She almost smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. I'll write his sister and say I hope his end is peaceful. That's true, and it's kind, and it costs me nothing, and it's the exact and entire measure of what that man will ever get from me again. Peace to him, and not one step of my summer. And she wrote it that same hour. 3 lines, civil cool, closing a door quietly instead of slamming it, and she sent it, and she never heard another word. And some weeks on, a notice came that Silas Whitcomb had died, and Eleanor read it standing in her own study under her father's portrait, and she felt to her own faint surprise almost nothing at all. Not triumph, not grief. A kind of distant closing the way you feel when a door in another part of a large house swings shut and you hear it without going to look. He's dead, she told Nathaniel that evening. Silas, this morning the notice says. How do you feel? That's the strange part. I feel like it happened to a stranger. I spent 16 years with that man at the center of everything, hiding from him, fearing him, and then this last year fighting him and beating him. And now he's dead, and I find he's already so far out of the middle of my life that I had to stop and think who the notice even meant. She set it down. That's what Dottie was trying to tell me at the end. About the mercy. She said I'd thank myself 20 years on for not carrying him. It's not been 1 year and I've already stopped carrying him. He died a stranger to me. That's the whole of my revenge, and I never lifted a hand for it. I just put him down and walked on. And he got lighter and lighter behind me until I forgot I'd ever been holding him at all. Nathaniel was quiet a moment. Dottie was the wisest soul I ever met, he said, and I met her twice. She'd have liked you saying that. She thought you were all right, you know. She told me so near the end. She said, Eleanor's voice went soft, remembering. She said that Ashford's got the disease of the lonely rich child he's forgotten. He's a person under all that money. But there's a person there, and if you dig him out, you'll find he's worth the digging. And she said... Eleanor stopped. Said what? She said I'd dig him out in the end, whether I meant to or not. She said I couldn't help myself, that I'd been starved of one good, honest thing so long, I'd not be able to walk past one when I finally found it. Eleanor looked at him across the study, across a year of careful distance, and kept promises and a foot of summer air held between them at a graveside. She was right about that too. She was right about everything. It's very tiresome being raised by a woman who's right about everything, because it means you spend your whole life catching up to what she already knew. And the thing stood there between them again, in the low firelight in the house that had been stolen and returned. And this time, Eleanor did not say, not yet. But she did not say the other thing either, not that night. Because there was one more thing she meant to do. First, one more thing she had been building toward all this long, slow, careful year. And she would not say the words to him until she had done. It would not come to him, as she'd promised at the graveside, until she came whole. She went up to the long gallery that night, after he'd gone, and she stood before her mother's portrait. The woman in the white gloves, shy Robert Whitcomb's bride, the face Eleanor could not remember without the painting to prompt it. And she reached inside her bodice to the place where for 16 years a single glove had been sewn into the lining against her heart. And she had some weeks before at last unpicked the stitches and taken it out, and she held it now in her hand. One white kid glove faded, worn soft embroidered at the cuff with the shield and the stag and the 3 stars. And beside it on the small table beneath the portrait lay its mate. Nathaniel had returned it to her the week she came home to Whitcomb Hall. The glove she'd dropped at the ball, the glove he'd carried in his breast pocket. Half a year, the glove that had led him through the parish registers and the wedding notices, and the half-blind cousin all the way to a little house at the edge of a mill town. He'd given it back without ceremony, put it in her hand and said, "This is yours. It was always yours." I only kept it safe, and she'd set it on the table under her mother's portrait, and not been able until now to bring herself to reunite the pair. Because to put them back together was to close something. And she had not been ready to close it. Not until she was whole. She was whole now. She took up the second glove from the table, and she held the pair of them together in her 2 hands in the gallery, under her mother's painted face, for the first time in 16 years, the glove that had never left her, and the glove that had traveled half of Virginia in a lonely man's pocket and found its way home. A pair. Reunited. Her mother's wedding gloves whole again, the way they'd been on the day shy Robert Whitcomb married the girl he could barely find his words for. "There," she said softly to the portrait. "There you are, Mama. Both of them. Home." And her voice when it came again was steady and clear and free. "I'm going to wear these. Did you know that when I marry, I'm going to wear your gloves to my own wedding the way you wore them to yours, and it won't be because I need him. I want you to know that wherever you are, I need you to know it. I've got my own house and my own name and my own land, and I don't need one single thing from any man alive. It'll be because I choose him, freely, the way you're supposed to, the way I never thought I'd get to." She pressed the gloves to her heart, both of them now the pair. "You'd have liked him, I think. Dottie did. And Dottie was right about everything." She went to him the next morning. She rode over herself alone, without sending word. Rode to the great Ashford house where it had all begun. Up the same drive she'd fled down a year ago, in the summer dark with one glove missing from her hand. She came in the full morning light this time. She was not running. She was not gray. She was not a companion or a fugitive or a dead girl or a nobody. She was Eleanor Grace Whitcomb of Whitcomb Hall, and she had come in her own person on her own horse of her own free will to say a thing to a man. He came out to meet her on the steps, the same steps she'd fled down, and the surprise on his face was total, because in a full year she had never once come to him. He had always come to her. He'd sworn not to move unless she told him to, and he'd kept it, and so for a whole year the moving had all been his, up the James and back, careful patient never staying. And now here she was on his own steps in the morning sun, and he understood at once from the fact of her coming alone uninvited, unannounced, that the terms had changed, that the woman who set the terms had come to set new ones. "Eleanor," he said, "careful even now. Is something wrong? Has something—" "Nothing's wrong," she said. She did not get down from the horse at once. She wanted to say it from a little height, oddly wanted the small advantage of it, wanted him looking up at her the way the whole county had once looked down on her. "I've come to say a thing, and I've practiced it the whole ride over, and I'll thank you not to interrupt me, or I'll lose my place and have to start again. I won't say a word. You'd better not." She took a breath. 4 in. Hold. And then she didn't need to count, and she let the count go, maybe for good. "A year ago you stood in a house at the edge of a mill town, and I set out the terms on which I'd let you help me, and you took every one of them, and you kept them. Every one. Even the ones that must have half killed you to keep. You had power over me when I had none. You could have swept in with your lawyers and your judges, and won the whole thing for me, and made me owe you my life, and every other man alive would have, and called it love, and I'd have spent the rest of my days grateful and small and owing. And you didn't. You handed me my own father's will across a table and told me it was mine, and put yourself under my orders and became the hired man. Her voice caught. She pushed through it. You had power over me, and you used it to make me free. Do you understand what that is? There's not one man in 1,000 who'd do it. There's not one man in 10,000. You took the one thing that could have owned me, and you handed it back and stepped away and said, your fight, your name, your terms. And I have spent a whole year, Nathaniel, trying to think of a single reason not to love a man who'd do that, and I can't find one. I've looked. I've been looking for a year. There isn't one. He opened his mouth. I'm not finished, she said. Sit down on the terms and be quiet. He shut it. I'm not coming to you because I need you. I want that understood between us, before anything else understood so deep it never has to be said again. I don't need you. I've got my own house, and my own name, and my own land, and my own money, and I could live the whole rest of my life alone in Whitcomb Hall, and want for nothing, and be, if not happy, then at least free. And after 16 years of being owned, I'd take free over happy any day of the week. So hear me. I don't need you. I've never needed you. Even at the worst of it, I built the trap myself, and you only gave it teeth. I have never once in this whole business been a woman who needed saving, and I never will be. And if you ever once treat me like one, I'll ride straight back through that gate, and you'll not see me again. I know, Nathaniel said, unable to help himself. I've always known. It's the whole of why I said quiet. But she was almost smiling now. I don't need you, and that's exactly why I can do this. Because a woman who needs a man can't ever really choose him. She's just taking what she can't do without, same as taking bread when you're starving, there's no choosing in it. But I'm not starving. I've got a whole house full of bread. And I'm choosing you anyway. Not because I have to. Not because I'm afraid to be alone. Not because you saved me. You didn't. I saved myself, and you handed me the tools. I'm choosing you the way my mother chose my father, freely with both hands, with nothing forcing it and nothing owed, because when I picture the rest of my life in that house, the only thing missing from it is you riding up the drive of a morning dry and clever and stubborn and mine. She finally swung down from the horse and stood before him on the steps and looked up into his face. So, that's the thing I came to say. And now you may speak. Nathaniel Ashford looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face she had never seen there, not at the ball, not at Dottie's table, not at the graveside. A thing that had been buried under 35 years of being wanted for the wrong reasons, dug out at last. May I ask you something then? He said. The thing I've wanted to ask for a year and swore I wouldn't until you told me I could. You may ask. He reached into his breast pocket, the same pocket she saw that had carried her glove half across Virginia. And this time he brought out nothing at all, because the glove was home now, back with its mate under her mother's portrait, and they both knew it, and it was better so. He had nothing in his hands. He came to her with empty hands, offering nothing, promising nothing, holding nothing over her. A man with no glove to return, no favor to trade, no power to wield, only himself, standing on the steps of his mother's house in the morning sun. Eleanor Grace Whitcomb, he said. You don't need me. You've made that plain, and thank God for it. Because I've had a lifetime of being needed for what I've got, and not 1 hour of being wanted for what I am till you. So I'll not ask you to need me. I'll only ask you to keep choosing me, every morning, free. The way you chose to ride over here today, with no one to make you. Marry me. Not to be saved, you're already saved, you did it yourself. Marry me because you'd rather I rode up your drive of a morning than didn't. That's the only reason I'll take, and it's the only reason worth having, and it's the one you just gave me. Marry me, Eleanor. Choose me, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never once regret you were free enough to. And Eleanor Whitcomb, who had been buried alive at 10 and had climbed back out of the ground a whole woman at 26, who had won her name in open court and her house from a thief, and her freedom from her own long fear, who needed no man and nothing on this earth, and had come anyway of her own free will, in the full light of morning, to choose one, said yes. Not because she needed him. She never needed him. Because she chose him, which was more. They married in the autumn in the small Virginia church where Robert Whitcomb had married the shy girl in the white gloves 31 years before. The same church, the same font, the same worn stone floor that had held her parents' feet. Eleanor walked in on no one's arm, because there was no one left to give her away, and she'd have refused the giving anyway, being no man's to give. She walked in alone, under her own name of her own will, up the same aisle her mother had walked, and she wore both white gloves. The pair. Reunited. The glove that had never left her, and the glove that had crossed half of Virginia in a lonely man's pocket and found its way home. She wore them on her two hands as she spoke her vows, and they fit, of course they fit. They were her mother's, and she was her mother's daughter. And every soul in that church who knew the story, and by then the whole county knew the story, understood what those gloves meant on those hands in that place. She did not weep at her own wedding. She had wept enough for 3 lives, and she was done with it mostly, and what she felt standing at that altar was too large and too steady for weeping. Dottie was not there to see it, and that was the one grief in the day, the one empty seat. But Eleanor had walked past the family plot on her way into the church and laid her hand on the deep-cut stone. She kept faith when all others stayed silent and said quiet just to the old woman under the grass. "You were right, about all of it. I dug him out same as you said, and he was worth the digging same as you said, and I'm wearing the gloves, and I'm home, and it came out right. You closed the book too early, Dottie. But you were right about how it ends." And then she'd gone in and married him. The glove that had once fallen from a terrified woman's hand on a ballroom floor dropped in flight in the worst moment of her grown life, the moment her whole careful hidden world came apart, had become in the end the very thing that led a good man to her, that proved her name in open court, that reunited a mother's wedding pair on a daughter's wedding hands. The thing she'd lost in her worst hour had turned out to be the thread that pulled her whole life back together. She thought about that sometimes in the years after that. The glove had fallen because she'd let herself be seen, and that letting herself be seen had been the most dangerous thing she'd ever done, and that it had also in the end been the thing that saved her. She had spent 16 years believing that to be seen was to be in danger. She spent the rest of her life knowing that to be seen by the right eyes freely was the only way anyone was ever truly safe. Eleanor Grace Whitcomb. Ashford lived a long life in the house she was born in under the name that was stolen from her, and won back with her own 2 hands, married to a man she never needed, and chose every single morning for 40 years, and not once. In all that long free life, from the day she stood at her own gate with the sun-warm iron under her palm, to the day they laid her at last in the Whitcomb ground beside the old nurse who kept faith, did any living soul ever again put a hand over Eleanor Whitcomb's mouth.